The judge held up his tablet, looked straight at my parents, and asked one question that drained every bit of confidence from their faces. If you truly loved both girls equally, why do the messages planning your family's future repeatedly center on only one granddaughter? In that instant, I realized this hearing was no longer merely about a guardianship petition. It was about the truth almost everyone in my family had assumed would remain hidden. My name is Ariel Chambers, and until 2 years ago, I believed the hardest thing I would ever do was bury my husband. Braden was the kind of father who could turn a rainy Saturday into an adventure with blankets, flashlights, and stories that made our daughters laugh until bedtime. When a distracted driver crossed the center line on a state highway outside Knoxville, Tennessee, all of that disappeared in one afternoon. After the funeral, people told me I was strong. They said I would get through it because mothers always found a way. The truth was much less inspiring. I cried in grocery store parking lots after buying Braden's favorite coffee by accident. I slept with my phone on his side of the bed for months because my brain refused to accept there would never be another late-night text asking if we needed milk on the way home. But every morning, I still got up before sunrise because Anna and Cherry needed breakfast, clean clothes, homework signed, and someone who could smile even when she wanted to fall apart. Anna, my oldest, was 11. She had inherited Braden's quiet eyes and thoughtful nature. She loved sketching birds she spotted outside her bedroom window and filled notebooks with tiny pencil drawings that looked far older than anything an 11-year-old should be able to create. Losing her father had changed her in ways most people couldn't see. She still smiled when Cherry told jokes, but she often watched conversations instead of joining them, carefully deciding whether her words were worth saying. Cherry was 8. Fearless where Anna was cautious, outgoing where Anna was reserved. She could introduce herself to strangers in a grocery line, convince neighbors to join sidewalk chalk contests, and somehow remember every dog's name in our subdivision. Watching them together reminded me so much of Braden. He used to say that sisters didn't need identical personalities to become best friends. They only needed to know someone would always stand beside them. I repeated those words to myself more often than I admitted. I worked as a pediatric occupational therapist at a rehabilitation clinic about 25 minutes from our house. The hours were long, but helping children regain independence after injuries or developmental challenges gave my own life structure. Every paycheck required careful planning. Mortgage, utilities, school lunches, soccer registration, art supplies. Unexpected expenses always seemed to arrive 2 days before payday. Still, we managed. We weren't wealthy, but our home felt safe, warm, and filled with routines that slowly stitched our lives back together. Then my parents suddenly became interested in helping. My parents, Earl and Diane Bennett, had always been financially comfortable. My father had retired after decades running a commercial construction company, while my mother spent years leading charity committees and organizing community events. Growing up, appearances mattered to them almost as much as accomplishments. They cared deeply about polished manners, perfect family photos, and what neighbors might think. Cherry's outgoing personality fit naturally into the kind of public family image they admired, while Anna's grief, silence, and sensitivity made them uncomfortable in ways they never admitted. They had rarely been openly cruel, but affection in our house often came wrapped inside expectations, comparison, and quiet forms of neglect that were easy to excuse until someone was deeply hurt. A week after Cherry's 8th birthday, they invited us to Sunday dinner. At first, everything seemed normal. My mother complimented Cherry's new dress before handing her an expensive wrapped present nearly twice the size of Anna's small gift. I noticed Anna forcing a smile as Cherry excitedly thanked them. I told myself it wasn't worth reading into. Maybe the presents had simply been purchased at different times. Then dessert arrived. My father asked Cherry about horseback riding lessons, even though Cherry had never taken one. He explained there was an excellent riding academy nearby and said he'd gladly cover every lesson. Anna quietly mentioned she wanted to attend a summer art program her teacher had recommended. My father nodded without looking at her and immediately returned to asking Cherry whether she preferred chestnut or white horses. Anna stopped talking before she finished her sentence. It happened again 3 weeks later when my parents surprised Cherry with tickets to a children's science museum nearly 2 hours away. Anna assumed she was coming too until my mother gently said, "Sweetheart, this trip is really designed for Cherry. You'll probably have more fun staying home with your mom." Anna simply said, "Okay," with a smile so practiced it frightened me. On the drive home, Cherry chatted excitedly about rockets and planetariums while Anna stared out the passenger window counting telephone poles. That night, after Cherry had gone to bed, Anna wandered into the kitchen while I packed lunches. "Mom?" she asked softly. "Yeah, sweetheart. Did I do something wrong?" I set the lunch containers down immediately. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged without meeting my eyes. "Grandpa always gets excited when Cherry comes over. Grandma always says how special she is. Maybe I'm harder to like." My chest tightened so suddenly I could barely breathe. I knelt beside her and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Listen to me very carefully. There is nothing wrong with you. Nothing. You are kind, smart, creative, and your dad would be so proud of the person you're becoming. Nobody gets to decide your value. Not even family." She nodded, but I could tell she wanted to believe me more than she actually did. Over the following month, the invitations became stranger. They always included Cherry by name. Sometimes Anna was mentioned almost as an afterthought. Sometimes she wasn't mentioned at all. When I politely declined invitations that excluded one daughter, my parents acted disappointed but never argued. Instead, they became unusually patient, almost as if they believed time itself would eventually persuade me. Looking back now, I understand they weren't waiting for me to change my mind. They were waiting for the right moment to make theirs. That moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I opened my mailbox after work and found a certified envelope addressed to me from the county family court. I stood in my kitchen holding the certified envelope while Cherry argued with the family dog over whose turn it was to sit by the window, and Anna quietly finished her math homework at the dining room table. For a few seconds I simply stared at the return address from the county family court, convinced it had to be a mistake. I had never been sued, never missed a court date, never even received a parking ticket. My hands shook as I opened the envelope with a butter knife. Inside was a petition requesting temporary guardianship of Cherry, filed by my parents. I read the first page twice before the words finally made sense. They claimed they could provide greater financial opportunities, stronger educational resources, and a more stable future for my younger daughter. They also argued that grief, long work hours, and financial pressure had left me too overwhelmed to meet what they described as Cherry's exceptional developmental needs, even though no teacher, doctor, or therapist had ever raised such a concern. There was no request involving Anna. There was no mention of keeping the sisters together. It was as though my oldest child did not exist. I folded the papers before either girl could notice my expression and forced myself to smile through dinner. After they went to bed, I called my parents. My father answered after only 2 rings. "You received the paperwork," he said calmly. It was not a question. "Tell me this is a misunderstanding," I replied. "You filed for guardianship of Cherry and left Anna out completely." There was a brief silence before he sighed. "Ariel, you are taking this too personally. We are trying to help. Help by separating sisters? Nobody is separating anyone. Anna is happy with you. Cherry simply has opportunities that should not be wasted." I felt my heartbeat quicken. They are not investments. They are children. My mother came onto the call. Her voice sounded gentle, almost rehearsed. "Ariel, sweetheart, please try to listen. Cherry has a personality that thrives in different environments. She would benefit from private schools, travel, and extracurricular programs that we can provide. Then provide them without taking her away." Another silence. Then my father spoke again. "That arrangement is not practical." I ended the call before I said something I would regret. The next morning I scheduled a consultation with a family attorney named Elise Goodwin, whose office overlooked the courthouse downtown. She listened carefully without interrupting while I explained everything that had happened during the past several months. When I finished, she leaned forward and asked one question. Have your parents ever shown a consistent preference for one child over the other? I thought about the birthday gifts, the museum trip, the horseback riding lessons, the family dinners, the photographs where Anna somehow always stood at the edge of the group. Yes, I answered quietly. I just kept convincing myself I was imagining it. Elise nodded slowly. Judges do not grant guardianship based on wealth alone. If there is evidence of favoritism that could emotionally harm the children, that becomes important. Her words gave me a small sense of hope. Then she added something that made my stomach tighten. But we will need evidence, not suspicions. I spent the next week gathering school records, medical records, financial statements, attendance reports, and letters from teachers describing both girls. Every evening after work I sat at my dining room table surrounded by folders while Anna colored beside me and Cherry practiced spelling words aloud. I did everything possible to make the process seem ordinary, but children notice more than adults realize. One Thursday evening Anna looked up from her sketchbook. Mom, are Grandpa and Grandma mad at us? I hesitated for only a moment. They are upset with me, not with either of you. Because they want Cherry? She asked so quietly I almost missed it. My heart stopped. Who told you that? She lowered her eyes. Nobody. I just hear things when adults think I am not listening. Before I could answer, Cherry wrapped her arms around Anna's shoulders from behind and laughed. We always stay together anyway. Anna smiled, but it was the kind of smile that disappeared the second someone looked away. 3 days later we attended my cousin Esther's backyard barbecue, the first extended family gathering since the court papers arrived. Conversation stopped for a split second when I walked through the gate. Then everyone acted as though nothing unusual had happened. My father grilled hamburgers. My mother carried lemonade between picnic tables. Cherry was immediately surrounded by relatives asking about school and summer plans. Anna wandered toward a maple tree with her sketchbook, unnoticed by almost everyone. I excused myself from a conversation with an aunt and walked over to sit beside her. She had begun drawing the family gathering from across the yard. Everyone appeared in the picture except herself. Why did you leave yourself out? I asked gently. She shrugged. I am holding the notebook. I knew that was not the real answer. Halfway through lunch, I walked into the house looking for the restroom. As I passed the kitchen, I heard my father speaking in the adjoining pantry. The hearing should move quickly, he said. Ariel cannot compete with what we can offer Cherry. Someone else answered too softly for me to recognize. Then my father laughed and added, eventually she will realize raising one child well is better than struggling with two. I froze outside the doorway. Before I could hear anything else, footsteps approached from the opposite hallway. I stepped into the bathroom just before my aunt entered the kitchen. My father never knew I had overheard him, but I drove home with a feeling I could not explain. This was no longer a disagreement between generations. It felt organized. Planned. Deliberate. 2 nights later, after I tucked both girls into bed, my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no explanation, only 6 screenshots from a family group chat I had never been invited to join, followed by one final message that read, "You deserve to know what they have been saying when you are not around. Please do not tell anyone these came from me." I stared at the unfamiliar number for almost a full minute before opening the screenshots. My first instinct was to assume they had been edited or taken out of context, but every image showed dates stretching back nearly 8 months. The group chat included my parents, several aunts and uncles, 2 cousins, and even a family friend who had known me since childhood. Among the adults in my parents' immediate family, I was the only one excluded. The first few messages seemed harmless enough. They discussed birthdays, holiday dinners, and neighborhood events. Then the conversation slowly shifted toward my daughters. My mother shared a photograph of Cherry smiling after a piano recital with the caption, "She really is the bright light in this family." Several relatives responded with heart emojis. Nobody mentioned Anna, even though she had performed in the same school program that evening with an art display in the lobby. I kept scrolling. My father wrote, "Cherry has confidence. She will go far if she has the right guidance." An aunt answered, "She reminds me of you when you were young." Again, nothing about Anna. At first I wondered if I was simply looking too hard for something offensive because emotions were already running high. Then I reached a conversation from 3 months earlier. One cousin asked whether both girls would be joining the annual lake trip. My father answered before anyone else could respond. Probably only Cherry. Anna never seems to enjoy those weekends anyway. My mother immediately replied, "She is so withdrawn these days. We cannot force personalities to change." My chest tightened because neither statement was true. Anna had never even been invited to the lake house after Braden passed away. They had quietly stopped asking. I continued reading with my hands trembling. The messages became increasingly difficult to ignore. One uncle commented that Cherry was outgoing enough to benefit from private schools. Another relative answered, "Money should be invested where it has the greatest chance to grow." My father replied with a simple thumbs up. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and walked to the sink, trying to steady my breathing. Everything Elise had asked me suddenly echoed in my mind. Had there been a consistent pattern of favoritism? I no longer had to wonder. It was sitting on my screen in black and white. When I finally picked up the phone again, I found a screenshot that made my stomach drop. A relative had asked whether separating the girls might create emotional problems. My father answered, "Children adapt faster than adults. Cherry deserves opportunities that should not be delayed because of her sister." Before I could process those words, another message appeared directly beneath it from my mother. "Ariel will resist at first, but eventually she will understand that one successful future is better than stretching every dollar across both girls." I read that sentence 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood it. My own mother had reduced her granddaughters to a calculation. I felt tears forming, but I refused to let myself cry until both girls were asleep. Instead, I forwarded every screenshot to Elise and typed only one sentence beneath them. "I think this is what you meant by evidence." Less than 10 minutes later my phone rang. "Do not delete anything," Elise said the moment I answered. "Save every image exactly as you received it. Also take screenshots showing the sender information and timestamps." "Will this help?" I asked quietly. "It could," she replied. "But we need to verify authenticity. Courts care about reliable evidence, not emotional reactions." Her calm professionalism reminded me why I had hired her. She was not making promises. She was building a case. The next morning, I went to work determined to keep life normal for my patients, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the messages. During my lunch break I checked my phone and found another message from the same unknown number. This time the message contained only 2 words above the attachments, "Keep looking." Attached were 4 additional screenshots that had not been included the night before. One of them contained a conversation dated only 6 weeks before my parents filed for guardianship. A cousin had written, "What if Ariel refuses?" My father responded, "Then we go through the court." Another relative asked, "What about Anna?" There was a 5-minute gap before my mother answered, "She belongs with Ariel. Cherry is the one we can still shape into the future she deserves." I sat alone in the employee break room staring at the screen until my lunch hour ended. The language was careful. Nobody openly insulted Anna. Nobody threatened anyone. But every sentence carried the same message. One granddaughter mattered more than the other. That afternoon I picked both girls up from school. Cherry talked non-stop about a science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda while Anna quietly carried a rolled-up drawing she had made during art class. When we arrived home, she handed it to me. It was a family portrait. Braden stood in the middle with his arms around all 3 of us. Above each person she had written one word. Dad. Mom. Anna. Cherry. Every name appeared in exactly the same size. Every smile looked identical. I hugged her a little longer than usual because I suddenly understood something painful. My daughter had been trying to hold our family together on paper while the adults around her were quietly pulling it apart in real life. That evening Elise called again. "I have reviewed everything you sent," she said. "These messages are significant, but there is something else you need to know." My heartbeat quickened. "What happened?" "Your parents filed an additional motion this afternoon asking the court to expedite the evidentiary hearing and place it on the calendar within the next few weeks." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Why so quickly?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "Because they are telling the judge that delaying the case could harm Cherry's future. We are going to have to respond immediately, and from this point forward, every decision you make could become part of the court record." The expedited evidentiary hearing was scheduled less than 3 weeks away, and suddenly every ordinary part of my life seemed to revolve around court deadlines, legal documents, and difficult conversations I never imagined having. With my own family. Elise helped me prepare my response, reminding me that family court focused on facts rather than emotions. We gathered school attendance records showing both girls were thriving, letters from teachers describing their close relationship, medical records confirming they were healthy and well cared for, and financial documents demonstrating that although I lived on a careful budget, my daughters had everything they needed. Every evening after work, my dining room table disappeared beneath neatly organized folders while Anna quietly finished homework beside me and Cherry practiced piano in the next room. I tried to keep our routines as normal as possible because children deserve stability even when adults failed to provide it. The hardest part was pretending nothing unusual was happening whenever the girls looked at me with worried eyes. Word about the guardianship dispute spread through the family much faster than I expected. Some relatives stopped calling altogether. Others suddenly reached out with carefully worded messages asking how I was holding up without actually offering support. Then there were a few people who quietly admitted they had been uncomfortable for years watching the obvious difference in how my parents treated my daughters. My cousin Esther invited me to coffee one Saturday morning while the girls attended a birthday party. She looked nervous before saying, "Ariel, I should have spoken sooner." I waited silently. She stared into her coffee cup. "Everyone noticed that your parents always focused on Cherry. Some of us convinced ourselves they were simply connecting with her personality. Others thought Anna was just shy and preferred staying in the background." She looked up at me with tears forming in her eyes. "We should have realized children do not put themselves in the background. Adults push them there." Her words stayed with me long after we left the cafe. For the first time, someone inside the family admitted that what I had seen was real. Still, not everyone agreed. 2 days later my Aunt Carol called insisting I was making the situation worse by refusing to compromise. "Your parents love both girls," she said. "They are only trying to give Cherry advantages you cannot afford. Then why not offer those opportunities to both daughters?" I asked. There was a long silence before she quietly answered, "Not every child has the same potential." I ended the conversation without another word because I finally understood that some people had accepted favoritism for so long they no longer recognized it. 2 weeks before the hearing, Elise called with another update. "The court has ordered psychological evaluations for everyone directly involved," she explained. "That includes you, your parents, and both girls." My stomach tightened. "Will Anna and Cherry have to testify?" "No," Elise answered reassuringly. "The evaluations are conducted by licensed child psychologists. The purpose is to understand family relationships, not to pressure children." Although I appreciated the explanation, I still worried about what the process would feel like for my daughters. I told them they would simply be talking with someone whose job was to help judges understand families better. Cherry accepted the explanation easily. Anna nodded politely but asked no questions. That silence worried me far more than tears would have. 3 evenings later I walked into Anna's bedroom carrying freshly folded laundry. At first everything looked normal. Then I noticed a small suitcase sitting beside her closet door. It was half full. Inside were several shirts, a pair of jeans, her sketchbook, colored pencils, her favorite stuffed rabbit, and the framed photograph of Brayden holding both girls at the county fair. I stood frozen for a moment before quietly asking, "Sweetheart, what is this?" Anna looked down at the floor instead of answering. I sat beside her on the bed. "Can you tell me?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I thought maybe if they only wanted Cherry, it would make everything easier if I was already packed. I felt as though the air had disappeared from the room. "Why would you think that?" She twisted the sleeve of her sweatshirt between her fingers. "Because everybody keeps talking about Cherry's future. Nobody talks about mine." Tears finally slipped down my face despite every promise I had made to myself about staying strong. I wrapped my arms around her as carefully as I could. "Listen to me. Nobody is sending you away. Nobody is replacing you. There is not a single future where I choose one daughter over the other." She held on to me for several minutes before quietly asking, "Promise?" "I promise with everything I have." That night, after both girls were asleep, I carried the suitcase back into the closet myself. I could not stop thinking about how an 11-year-old child had prepared to leave her own home without anyone telling her to. The emotional damage my parents insisted did not exist had already taken root. The following afternoon Elise called again. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "Ariel, the court-appointed psychologist has completed the first round of interviews with the adults." "How did it go?" I asked. "I cannot discuss confidential details," she replied, "but I can tell you something important. The evaluator has requested additional interviews after noticing significant differences in how various family members describe the relationship between your two daughters." I felt a small spark of hope. Does that mean she noticed the favoritism? Elise paused before answering carefully. "It means she believes there are questions that require much closer examination." Before I could ask anything else, another notification appeared on my phone. It was an email from the court confirming that new evidence had been submitted by the opposing side only minutes earlier, and Elise quietly added, "Whatever they just filed, we are going to need to review it immediately because this case just became far more complicated than either of us expected." Elise emailed me the new filing before I even reached her office the next morning. I parked outside the courthouse, opened the document on my phone, and felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. My parents had not produced any evidence that I was neglecting my daughters. They had not claimed my home was unsafe or that the girls were struggling in school. Instead, nearly every page focused on financial opportunities, extracurricular programs, and educational advantages they believed they could provide for Cherry. Anna was mentioned only twice in the entire filing, both times as Cherry's older sister. There was no discussion of her emotional well-being, her education, her interests, or her relationship with Cherry. It was almost as though she existed only because the court required acknowledgement that there were two children in the family. Elise quietly closed the file after we finished reading. "This helps us more than it helps them," she said. "Why?" I asked. "Because they are asking the court to separate siblings without explaining why that separation would benefit both children. Family courts generally begin with the assumption that keeping siblings together is in their best interest unless there is a compelling reason otherwise." Her explanation eased my mind slightly, but neither of us underestimated the resources my parents were willing to invest. They had experienced attorneys, financial experts, and years of community influence behind them. We needed more than confidence. We needed facts that could not be explained away. 2 days later the court-appointed child psychologist met separately with both girls. The sessions took place in a quiet office filled with books, games, and comfortable chairs rather than anything that resembled a courtroom. I waited outside in the reception area trying to read a magazine without absorbing a single word. Cherry finished first. She skipped into the waiting room smiling as though she had just completed another ordinary school activity. She asked me about soccer and science class, Cherry said happily. And she asked who makes the best pancakes. I smiled. "What did you tell her?" Cherry grinned. "You do. Grandpa burns them." It was such an innocent answer that I laughed for the first time in days. Then Anna walked out 20 minutes later. She looked calm, but I noticed she was holding her sketchbook much tighter than usual. During the drive home she quietly stared out the window while Cherry talked about everything except the evaluation. That evening, after Cherry fell asleep, Anna wandered into the kitchen while I washed dishes. "The lady asked me if I ever felt left out," she said softly. I turned off the water and listened. "What did you tell her?" Anna hesitated before answering. "I said sometimes people forget I am in the room. But Cherry never forgets." I swallowed hard. "Anything else?" She nodded. "She asked if I wanted to live somewhere else." My heart skipped. "What did you say?" Anna looked directly at me. "I said wherever Cherry lives is where I belong." I wrapped my arms around her, realizing that without trying, my 11-year-old daughter had summarized everything this case should have been about. The following afternoon Elise called while I was finishing paperwork at the rehabilitation clinic. "The psychologist has submitted a preliminary summary to both legal teams," she said. "It does not contain her final recommendation, but it includes 2 significant observations." I closed my office door. "What is it?" "The preliminary summary describes the sisters as sharing an exceptionally healthy emotional bond. It also notes concern that one child appears to have internalized the belief that she is less valued by certain family members." I closed my eyes. She noticed. "Yes," Elise replied. "And that observation carries weight because it comes from an independent evaluator rather than from us." For the first time since the case began, I felt genuine hope. But that feeling lasted only until the next morning when Elise forwarded another discovery packet produced through the court process. My parents had turned over additional electronic communications requested during pretrial disclosure. Most of the material repeated themes we had already seen. Conversations about schools, summer camps, and Cherry's future appeared again and again. Then Elise highlighted one exchange I had somehow missed. A relative asked whether Anna would be hurt if Cherry moved in with my parents. My father answered, "Children recover. We cannot allow emotions to interfere with practical decisions." Reading those words was painful enough, but Elise instructed me to keep going because the next page mattered even more. There, buried among dozens of routine family messages, was a short conversation discussing the upcoming guardianship filing before it had ever reached the courthouse. 1. Cousin wrote, "Are you sure Ariel will not fight this?" My mother answered, "She will, but eventually she will become exhausted." I felt physically ill. They had anticipated not only my refusal but the emotional toll the process would take on me. Elise remained composed. "Planning litigation is not improper," she said carefully. "But these messages help establish a pattern. They repeatedly frame one granddaughter as the future worth protecting while minimizing the emotional impact on the other child." Later that evening another unexpected development arrived. The anonymous relative who had first sent the screenshots contacted me again. This time there were no attachments, only a brief message. "You still do not have the worst conversation. They deleted it, but I think someone kept a copy." I immediately forwarded the message to Elise. Within 15 minutes she called back. "Do not respond," she said. "If another family member preserved deleted communications or recordings, we need to obtain them properly so they can be authenticated." "Do you think something like that actually exists?" I asked. Elise paused before answering. "I do not know. But people who believe private conversations will never become public often say far more than they would ever admit in court." 3 days later, just as we were preparing our final evidence binder, Elise received notice that Esther had preserved an audio recording from a family dinner. She had submitted the original file, along with a sworn statement explaining when and why she recorded it, so that it could be formally exchanged between both legal teams. Her statement also confirmed that she had been the anonymous relative who sent me the screenshots. She had been afraid of confronting the family openly, but she had finally decided that silence was causing more harm than the truth. Elise looked up from her computer and said, "Ariel, opposing counsel has already begun reviewing the recording, and judging by the conversation described in Esther's statement, this may change everything about the case." Esther's original recording and sworn statement were formally exchanged between both legal teams 2 business days before the hearing. Elise invited me to her office rather than discussing it over the phone, which immediately told me it was important. She closed the conference room door, placed a laptop on the table, and said, "Before we play this, remember that the court still has to determine how much weight to give it. We are not going to assume anything. We are simply going to listen." I nodded even though my stomach felt tied in knots. The recording began with ordinary background sounds that suggested several people were gathered after a family dinner. Dishes clinked. Someone laughed in another room. Then I recognized my father's voice. He sounded relaxed, almost casual. A relative asked whether filing for guardianship might damage the relationship between the sisters. My father answered without hesitation. "The younger one is adaptable. She will thrive anywhere." Another voice quietly asked, "And Anna?" There was a brief pause before my father replied, "Anna has become too emotionally dependent on her mother. Separating them would only be difficult for a while. Children adjust." Nobody challenged him. Nobody reminded him that he was discussing an 11-year-old child. A few seconds later another relative asked whether taking both girls had ever been considered. My father answered, "No. That defeats the entire purpose." The room fell silent as the recording continued. Then came the sentence that none of us expected. "We cannot build the future we want if we divide our attention equally." Elise stopped the recording. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she said, "This is not about proving someone loves one grandchild more than another. Courts do not measure affection. But statements like these can become relevant when they reveal the reasoning behind major decisions affecting children." I slowly nodded. Hearing the words aloud carried a completely different weight than reading text messages. Tone mattered. Confidence mattered. There had been no uncertainty in my father's voice. He genuinely believed he was making the responsible choice. Elise instructed me not to contact any family members about the recording. "If emotions escalate now, it serves nobody," she said. "Our job is to remain focused on the children." I appreciated the reminder because part of me wanted to call my parents immediately and ask how they could discuss Anna as though she were an obstacle instead of their granddaughter. Instead I drove home and tried to preserve one ordinary evening with my daughters. Cherry insisted that we make homemade cookies together while Anna carefully shaped the dough into tiny flowers before placing them on the baking tray. Watching them laugh over melted cheese and flour on the kitchen counter reminded me exactly what this case had overlooked from the beginning. My daughters were not competing futures. They were sisters who made each other stronger every single day. Halfway through dinner Cherry suddenly looked at Anna and asked, "If I ever go somewhere, you are coming too, right?" The room became very quiet. Anna smiled gently. "Only if you promise to save me the last cookie." Cherry immediately placed the largest cookie on Anna's plate. "Deal." They both laughed, unaware that they had just answered the central question adults had spent weeks arguing about. Later that night I shared the conversation with Elise. She simply said, "Children often express the truth much more clearly than adults." The morning of the hearing arrived with gray skies and steady rain. I dressed in a navy suit, dropped the girls at school after reminding them I loved them, and drove downtown with a folder that represented weeks of preparation. Elise met me outside the courthouse entrance carrying 2 organized binders and a calm expression I had come to rely upon. Inside the courtroom my parents were already seated with their attorney. My mother smiled politely when our eyes met, but my father remained focused on reviewing documents. It struck me that he looked less like a grandfather worried about family relationships and more like a businessman preparing for an important meeting. As the evidentiary hearing began, the judge explained that the court's responsibility was to determine whether the requested temporary guardianship served the best interests of the children, not the preferences of the adults. Witnesses testified about school performance, home routines, and family interactions. Teachers described both girls as respectful, academically successful, and deeply attached to one another. The court-appointed psychologist explained that separating siblings with such a strong emotional bond could create unnecessary emotional harm unless there were compelling circumstances that justified it. She also confirmed that Anna consistently expressed concern about being less valued by certain relatives, while Cherry repeatedly described her sister as the person she trusted most. My parents' attorney emphasized financial opportunities, educational resources, and future advantages. Elise responded by reminding the court that no evidence suggested the girls were unsafe, neglected, or struggling in my care. Then she requested permission to introduce the recovered recording along with the authenticated message history already admitted into evidence. My father's attorney objected, but after reviewing Esther's sworn statement, the original file metadata, and the parties' authentication agreement, the judge allowed the recording to be played. The courtroom became completely still as my father's voice filled the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody shifted in their seat. When the recording ended, I glanced toward my parents for the first time in nearly an hour. My mother was staring down at the table. My father remained expressionless, but for the first time since this case began, he avoided looking toward the bench. The judge quietly thanked both attorneys, organized several exhibits into a neat stack, and then reached for a tablet that had been loaded with the authenticated family messages, saying, "Before this court reaches any conclusions, there is one area of evidence I intend to review personally because patterns sometimes reveal facts that isolated statements cannot." The courtroom remained so quiet that I could hear the faint tapping of rain against the windows as the judge unlocked the tablet and began reviewing the authenticated family messages one by one. Nobody spoke. Even the attorneys remained seated without interruption. After several minutes, the judge looked up and addressed both sides. "I have read the brief submitted by counsel," he said evenly. "Now I would like clarification regarding the communications exchanged among family members over the past several months." He turned toward my parents' attorney first. "Would you agree these messages have been authenticated through discovery?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney answered. "We do not dispute authenticity." The judge nodded and looked back at the screen. "Very well." He adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. "Cherry has confidence. She will go far if she has the right guidance." He paused briefly before continuing. "Money should be invested where it has the greatest chance to grow." Another pause. "Ariel will resist at first, but eventually she will understand that one successful future is better than stretching every dollar across both girls." Every sentence echoed through the courtroom with far greater weight than it ever carried on a phone screen. Written words sounded different when spoken aloud by a judge instead of silently read in private. He continued scrolling through the conversation history. "I also note repeated references to educational opportunities, travel, extracurricular activities, and financial investment directed toward one granddaughter." He looked directly at my parents. "If you truly loved both girls equally, why do the messages planning your family's future repeatedly center on only one granddaughter?" He paused, allowing the silence to settle over the courtroom. "Can either of you identify comparable discussions regarding Anna?" My father's attorney stood and responded carefully. "Your Honor, these conversations should be viewed in context. The family believed Cherry's interests aligned more closely with the opportunities being discussed." The judge nodded politely. "Context is precisely what I am examining." He returned to the tablet. "Across dozens of messages extending over many months, I find repeated planning regarding one child and remarkably little discussion concerning the emotional welfare of the other." The courtroom remained completely still. My mother slowly lowered her eyes to the table. My father maintained his composure, but I noticed him clasping his hands more tightly than before. The judge then opened another exhibit. "This conversation asks what effect separating the sisters might have." He read my father's response aloud. "Children adapt faster than adults." Another brief silence followed. Then he read the next message. "We cannot build the future we want if we divide our attention equally." No one reacted immediately. The words simply hung in the room. Finally the judge looked toward my parents. "Mr. Bennett, would you like to explain what you meant by this statement?" My father stood slowly. His voice remained respectful. "Your Honor, my intention was never to harm Anna. I believed Cherry possessed certain talents that could flourish with additional resources. I simply wanted to provide opportunities." The judge listened without interruption. Did you ever consider providing opportunities without separating siblings? My father hesitated for the first time. We believed that arrangement would be impractical. Impractical for whom? The judge asked calmly. My father searched for an answer but none came. That brief silence seemed to speak louder than any prepared argument. Halfway through the hearing, the judge requested the court-appointed psychologist return to the witness stand. Doctor, he said, based upon your evaluation, how did each child describe her relationship with the other? She answered without hesitation. Both sisters consistently described one another as their primary source of comfort following their father's death. Neither child expressed any desire to live separately. In fact, each independently assumed the other would always remain part of her daily life. Did either child demonstrate signs of conflict with her sister? No, Your Honor. Did you observe emotional concerns? The psychologist nodded. The older child appears to have gradually accepted the belief that certain adults value her less than her younger sister. That perception did not originate from sibling conflict. It appears connected to repeated differences in adult behavior over an extended period. Several relatives sitting in the gallery quietly lowered their heads. I recognized Esther wiping tears from her face. Another aunt stared at the floor as though unable to meet anyone's eyes. The judge thanked the psychologist before turning once more toward the tablet. Patterns matter, he said. One isolated statement may be misunderstood. Repeated statements over time deserve careful attention. He looked directly at my parents again. This court is not evaluating whether grandparents may prefer certain activities with one grandchild over another. Families are imperfect. The issue before this court is whether the evidence demonstrates decision-making that failed to adequately consider the emotional interests of both children. Nobody attempted to interrupt him. My father's attorney quietly requested permission to emphasize that his clients loved both granddaughters. The judge acknowledged the statement with a respectful nod. I do not doubt that affection exists, he replied. However, affection alone does not resolve the concerns raised by the evidence. He carefully organized several exhibits into separate stacks before continuing. The communications presented today reveal a consistent pattern of planning centered upon one granddaughter's future while treating the separation of siblings as a manageable inconvenience rather than a serious emotional consideration. I glanced toward Elise. She remained perfectly still, taking notes without any visible celebration. She understood better than anyone that the hearing was not over until the court reached its final decision. After another few minutes of reviewing documents, the judge closed the tablet and folded his hands. The court has received sufficient testimony, documentary evidence, and professional evaluations, he said. I will take a brief recess to organize my findings before announcing my decision from the bench today. As everyone slowly stood, the courtroom doors opened for the short recess. Just before the judge stepped into his chambers, he turned back toward the attorneys and added one final sentence that sent another wave of tension through the room. When this court reconvenes, I will address not only the guardianship request itself, but also what these communications reveal about future contact between the children and the adults involved. When the judge returned to the courtroom, every conversation stopped immediately. The attorneys stood, followed by everyone else, and then quietly took their seats again after the judge nodded. He arranged several pages of handwritten notes beside the tablet before speaking in the same calm, measured tone that had carried through the entire hearing. This court recognizes that grandparents often wish to provide opportunities for their grandchildren, he began. There is nothing improper about generosity, educational support, or financial assistance when those efforts strengthen family relationships. However, this matter is not about generosity. It is about whether the proposed guardianship serves the best interests of the children involved. He paused briefly before continuing. After reviewing the testimony, documentary evidence, psychological evaluations, and authenticated communications, this court finds no evidence that Ariel Chambers is unable to provide a safe, stable, and loving home for either daughter. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks, but I remained completely silent. The judge continued. The court also finds that the sisters share an unusually strong emotional bond following the loss of their father. Every independent evaluation presented during these proceedings supports preserving that relationship. He looked toward my parents. The guardianship petition requests the separation of siblings without demonstrating that such separation would benefit both children. The evidence before this court does not support that conclusion. My father lowered his eyes while my mother quietly folded a tissue in her hands. The judge turned another page in his notes. This court is also concerned by the documented pattern of communications minimizing the emotional consequences of separating the sisters while consistently emphasizing the future of only one granddaughter. He did not raise his voice. He did not criticize anyone personally. His words remained entirely focused on the children. Family members are free to recognize different talents, interests, and personalities. They are not free to disregard the emotional well-being of one child while pursuing opportunities for another. Elise remained perfectly composed beside me, but I noticed the slightest smile appear as she wrote one final note across the top page of her legal pad. Then came the sentence I had prayed to hear ever since the certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Accordingly, the petition for temporary guardianship is denied. A quiet breath seemed to leave the entire courtroom at once. Before anyone could react further, the judge continued speaking. This ruling should not be interpreted as punishment. It is a determination based upon the best interests of the children under the evidence presented. He then addressed something none of us had fully anticipated. Because the evidence has revealed concerns regarding the emotional impact of repeated favoritism, I urge every adult involved to proceed carefully. Whether and when extended contact resumes will remain Ariel Chambers' decision as the girl's mother, but this court strongly encourages family counseling before trust is rebuilt. My father's attorney acknowledged the court's remarks without further argument. The formal order would address the guardianship petition itself, while the responsibility for rebuilding trust would remain with our family. Halfway through the ruling, I noticed movement in the gallery. My cousin Esther quietly wiped away tears while another aunt reached for her hand. Several relatives who had defended my parents throughout the dispute no longer looked toward the front of the courtroom. Instead, they stared at the floor as though finally confronting something they had ignored for years. Once the judge completed the formal order, he thanked both attorneys for their professionalism and prepared to adjourn the hearing. Before he did, however, he looked directly at my parents one final time. "Children measure love through consistent actions," he said. "Adults sometimes underestimate how clearly those actions are remembered." No one answered because there was nothing left to argue. The hearing ended. People slowly gathered their belongings and began leaving the courtroom in respectful silence. Elise shook my hand before quietly saying, "You protected your daughters. That is what mattered." I thanked her, but before I could follow her into the hallway, someone softly called my name. I turned and found Esther standing a few feet away. Her eyes were red from crying. "Ariel," she said, "I owe Anna an apology." She walked with me to the courthouse lobby, where a close family friend had brought both girls after picking them up from school near the end of the hearing. Anna looked uncertain as Esther knelt until they were at eye level. "I want to tell you something that adults should have said a long time ago," Esther began gently. "I saw times when you were treated differently, and I stayed quiet because I thought it was not my place. I was wrong. You deserved someone to speak up for you." Anna looked surprised more than anything else. She glanced toward me before quietly answering, "Thank you." Esther smiled through her tears. "You never needed to earn your place in this family. I am sorry we made you feel like you did." Standing nearby, Cherry slipped her hand into Anna's without saying a word. The two sisters stood shoulder to shoulder exactly as they always had. Watching them together, I realized they had somehow protected each other even while adults around them failed to do the same. As we stepped outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, reflecting across the wet courthouse steps. I thought the hardest part was finally over until I heard someone behind me quietly say, "Ariel, please wait." I turned around expecting to see one of the attorneys. Instead, I found my mother standing alone while my father remained several yards behind her, and the expression on her face told me she was about to reveal something I had never expected to hear. I asked our family friend to take Cherry and Anna to the car for a few minutes. The girls waved before walking toward the parking lot together, still holding hands. I watched them until they disappeared around the corner, then turned back to my mother. She looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. For several moments she simply stood there, twisting her wedding ring without saying a word. Finally she whispered, "I owe you an apology." I waited quietly. "Not because we lost today," she continued, her voice unsteady. "Because somewhere along the way, I convinced myself I was helping without noticing who was being hurt." I studied her face, searching for the confidence she had carried throughout the hearing, but it was gone. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked. It was never the court papers. It was realizing that Anna believed she mattered less because too many adults in her own family had acted as though she did. Tears filled my mother's eyes. I did not think she noticed. I shook my head gently. Children notice far more than we give them credit for. My father slowly approached but stopped several feet away. For the first time since Braden's funeral, he looked uncertain about what to say. "Ariel," he began quietly, "I truly believed I was making the practical decision." I answered honestly. "That is exactly what frightened me. You never thought you were choosing between two grandchildren. You convinced yourself you were investing in one future instead of protecting two hearts." He lowered his head. "I turned love into a calculation," he said quietly. "And Anna paid the price for it." For once, he did not try to defend himself. After another long silence, my mother reached into her handbag and removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "There is something I want you to have," she said. "When we cleaned the attic last month, I opened an old cedar storage chest where I had been placing Anna's cards and drawings whenever I told myself I would look through them later. After this case began, I finally sat down and opened every envelope." She placed the key in my hand. "Everything in that chest belongs to Anna's childhood, and I think she deserves to decide what happens to it now." Confused, I drove to my parents' house later that afternoon while the girls stayed with Esther. My parents quietly led me upstairs to the attic. The cedar chest stood beneath a small attic window, its surface dusty even though the lock had recently been opened. I turned the key and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of carefully stacked envelopes. Handmade birthday cards, elementary school drawings, Christmas ornaments made from popsicle sticks, report cards, and photographs. I recognized Anna's handwriting immediately. Most of the cards, drawings, and handmade ornaments had been created for her grandparents over the years, while the report cards and photographs documented moments they had barely taken time to notice. Several of the older envelopes had been opened only after the court case began, their folds still crisp and their stickers nearly untouched. Some still carried the colorful stickers she loved using in second grade. Others contained folded drawings of family vacations she had imagined taking together. My mother covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Every time Anna gave us something, I told myself I would sit down and give it the attention it deserved later," she whispered. Later became years. I carefully picked up one drawing showing Braden standing between both girls while everyone held hands beneath a bright yellow sun. On the back Anna had written, "Grandma and Grandpa, I hope we all stay together forever." I could barely breathe as I read the words. That evening I brought the entire cedar chest home. After dinner I placed it on the kitchen table and told Anna there was something she deserved to see. She opened the first envelope slowly, then another, then another. She never complained. She never asked why they had remained unopened. Instead she smiled gently at each drawing as though greeting old friends she had almost forgotten. Finally, she looked up at me. "Can I keep all of these?" she asked. "Of course," I answered. She carried the box into her bedroom and carefully placed every drawing on a bookshelf beside the framed photograph of Braden. She did not display them as reminders of rejection. She displayed them because they represented love she had freely given, regardless of how imperfectly it had been received. Over the following months, life gradually settled into familiar routines again. Family counseling began with slow, uncomfortable conversations that nobody could rush. Trust did not return overnight, and nobody expected it to. My parents attended every session without missing one. They listened more than they spoke. They learned to ask Anna about her artwork before asking Cherry about soccer. Small moments replaced grand gestures. On Anna's 12th birthday, my father arrived carrying nothing expensive. Instead, he handed her a wooden sketch box he had built himself during a beginner woodworking class he had started after the hearing. Inside the lid he had carved 6 simple words. Your dreams deserve space too. Anna studied the carved words for several quiet seconds, then smiled, thanked him, and stepped forward to give him a careful hug. It was not because the past had disappeared. It was because healing had quietly begun. One warm spring evening nearly a year later, I stood in our backyard watching Cherry chase fireflies while Anna sat on the porch sketching the sunset. Braden used to say that the strongest families were not the ones that avoided mistakes. They were the ones willing to face them honestly before it was too late. Looking at my daughters, I finally understood what he meant. The courtroom had not saved our family. It had simply forced every adult to see 2 little girls the way they should have been seen from the very beginning. Closing reflection. Perhaps one of the quietest forms of love is making sure no child ever has to wonder whether there is enough room in someone's heart for them. This story reminds us that fairness is not always measured by matching gifts or identical opportunities. Sometimes it is found in the small, consistent moments when people feel noticed, included, and valued exactly as they are. There are times when good intentions slowly drift away from compassion without anyone realizing it. There are also moments when honesty, although uncomfortable, becomes the first step toward rebuilding trust. Families rarely become stronger because everything goes perfectly. More often, they grow when people are willing to recognize old mistakes, listen with humility, and choose a different path together. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you found yourself in Ariel's position, how would you have protected both daughters while leaving room for healing, and what part of this family's journey resonated most with your own experiences or beliefs?